Hey guys, welcome to another recipe video. In this one, I would like to continue on the croissant series. In the first episode, I gave a really nice overview of what exactly goes into making the perfect croissant. So if you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend that you see that video, which I'm linking in the description box, so that you can execute the next recipe perfectly. I also have made pain au chocolat if you're interested in that. I'm going to have a link to all of these videos in the description box. And don't you worry, I will explain in full detail in those videos before you continue with this one. This is the third episode in that series. So I wanted to keep this video short and not focus on the stuff that has already been discussed in those videos. If you haven't seen them, check them out, because that's going to guarantee that you have a beautiful flaky pastry in the end. So what exactly are we going to make today? Well, I'm going to show you how to make the so-called fattiest pastry in the world, and that is the Kouign Amann. And this is a signature pastry in the region of Brittany in France. Now, why do I make such a fuss about having all that knowledge in terms of making the perfect croissant dough? Well, that is our main ingredient for this pastry. We mainly have the croissant dough plus, you might have guessed it, more butter and more sugar. So that's why you see that this might be considered the fattiest pastry in the world. But anyhow, I'm assuming that you have your croissant dough ready to go. I'm using exactly one recipe. The recipe is in the description box, so you don't have to look that up. So let's get started. This is our new ingredient, sugar. Yes, we have additional sugar for this pastry, and I have 100 to 150 grams of sugar. The total amount of sugar that you will end up using depends on what kind of rings you use for your Kouign Amanns. So I'm sprinkling generously some sugar on the counter and also on top of the dough, and I'm gonna roll this into a rectangle of about 50 centimeters by 15 centimeters, and most importantly 4 millimeters in thickness. So it's the same thickness as you would use for a croissant. Continue to sprinkle some sugar if you find any dry patches. Now at this point, I finished rolling out my dough, so I'm ready to prepare my baking tray and my tart rings. So what I have are some tart rings that are 7.5 centimeters in diameter, and I will place those on a tray fitted with a silicone mat. So what I want to do is roughly trace out where my tart rings will go on the silicone mat. And I'm buttering those areas generously. So depending how big your baking tray is, you might be able to fit more or less than I am. So I'm just gonna make half a dozen, but the whole recipe will be enough for about a dozen of these. Just consider the size of the rings that you have. And finally, you want to butter the sides or the walls of your tart rings. And since you already decided to make the fattiest pastry in the world, then don't be shy with how generously you butter these, because in the end, that's gonna help us create this really incredible layer of caramelized sugar. Because yes, there's more sugar coming. And this step is really what gives us the signature caramelized side of our pastry. So I am sprinkling again generously the areas where I've buttered my silicone mat, as well as the sides of the tart ring. So don't worry, we'll get rid of the excess sugar, but for now we just want to make sure that everything has enough butter and sugar so that when it hits that oven, you get that caramelly, gooey layer for all of your Kouign Amanns. So this is where the silicone mat comes in handy. Just keep the rest of the sugar for the next batch in case you have a second batch coming. And we are ready to start assembling our Kouign Amanns. Now for the croissant, what we did was cut a triangular shape so that we could roll it into that beautiful shape that we all know and love. And for the Kouign Amann, what we need is a perfect square. So for my tart rings, remember I'm using 7.5 centimeter tart rings. So I'm cutting 7.5 centimeter squares. So all the lengths will have the same 7.5 centimeters. So I like to use a ruler just to be a bit precise, but I do tend to eyeball sort of where I need to cut. And once you get your perfect square, then it's time to shape these. And at this point, I would suggest that you start preheating your oven. So I got my tart rings ready to go. And all we need to do is fold the corners towards the center so that they all meet in the center. So I start with opposite corners and end with opposite corners. And then the folded side will have to go at the bottom. So that's what will face the sugar, and that is what will get caramelized. So just repeat, it doesn't have to be perfect. You can still push it down once you put it inside the ring. Baking them with the folded side facing the bottom is great because it ensures that the pastry doesn't unravel when it bakes, and also gives us a very nice design on the caramel side. So these are ready for the oven. I have a 180 Celsius and they take about 20 to 25 minutes until they are golden brown like this. And one important thing is that you want to remove your tart rings while they're still hot, because that sugar is in a caramel state right now, and when it gets cooler, then it will become really hard and almost impossible to remove the tart rings. So it's best to do this now. Just make sure you don't burn yourself. And I also like to flip them over while they are still warm. And look at that. You can even see the lamination through the corners. And you should have a perfectly caramelized bottom. I suggest that, because this is sugar essentially, I really suggest that you wait until they're cooled down completely. And they are best if eaten on the same day. And that's it. We've just made Kouign Amanns from scratch, and they are truly special, not to mention delicious. And before I go, I obviously want to show you what they look like inside. So both sides of the Kouign Amann are actually crispy. One is caramelized, the other one is just crispy. And the interior should be very flaky because this is, after all, a croissant dough. We don't let them ferment before baking like we do with croissants. Therefore, you don't get that honeycomb structure, but you will see all the layers built during your lamination step. You could enjoy these with a little sprinkle of salt, some sea salt, just to balance out the sweetness from all that sugar. But the salt is optional. And that's it. I really hope you enjoyed this last episode of the croissant series. If you have been following, thank you so much. And if you have made the recipe, please let me know in the comments. I would love to hear from you. And until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.